It's a bit more
yeah, it
focused.
was. I think we had a clear idea of, what songs were going to be on it and stuff. But at the same time, we were working in the same way. But I think the new album is a step up from that, in the way we're working.
Although the Libertines' identity was defiantly English, they had no problem with the idea of preaching the Arcadian gospel to a wider congregation. April 2003 saw gigs in Japan and the United States, including a coveted slot on the David Letterman show. However, Carl's exit from the Albion Rooms had not soothed tensions between him and Pete. At the end of May, Doherty played an impromptu solo gig in West London and asked Carl to join him for a similar escapade a few days later, this time on a rooftop in the East End. Carl didn't show up, not just because it seemed to be a premature attempt to echo the Beatles' final live appearance on the roof of the Apple Building, but because it was his birthday and he had better things to do. His judgment somewhat clouded by the chemicals he was pumping into his body, Pete took mortal offence at the snub and failed to show up for the band's scheduled European tour. Once again, the Libertines pressed on without Doherty, this time declaring that he was suspended from the band until he cleaned himself up. At first, Pete denied that anything was wrong with him, but he eventually agreed to enter rehab for his various addictions. The band's policy of performing without him was risky. It could either have shocked him into sobriety or pushed him further down the road to terminal self-pity and self-destruction. Sadly, it appeared that he was taking the latter path as he walked out of his rehab centre after less than a week of therapy. Then, at the end of July, Doherty's behaviour finally got out of control when he was arrested for burglary. While the rest of the band were in Asia, he had broken into Carl's new flat and stolen musical and computer equipment. His garbled explanations veered from confused revenge for his estrangement from the band to the need to pay the wages of 2 musicians who were helping him with a new project, known as Baby Shambles. Most people reckoned he simply wanted to sell the stuff so he could buy drugs. Carl was put into an impossible situation. His instincts were to protect his oldest friend and not press charges. But this would be tantamount to telling the world that nothing was wrong, and it was the collective blind eye that Doherty's friends turned to his drug abuse that had caused the mess to happen in the first place. Moreover, bringing the weight of the law down on Pete might remind him that the real world wasn't Arcadia and that he had some responsibilities, not least to the band that he'd helped create. In the end, he decided to follow the legal route, and Pete was committed for trial. At the very least, it forced the singer to confront the mess he'd got into. Yes, I'm a heroin addict, he confirmed. Yes, I'm addicted to crack cocaine, and I don't know what to do. Any hope that the prospect of jail might have encouraged Pete to see the light was squashed by the singer's behaviour. Baby Shambles seemed to be a surefire crowd pleaser. On the other hand, more cynical observers might have deduced that the punters were simply keen to see a celebrity casualty in action before he pressed the ultimate self-destruct button. Meanwhile, the remaining Libertines attempted to maintain some semblance of business as usual. The new single, Don't Look Back at the Sun, just failed to make the British top 10, and the band played at Leeds and Reading Festival with the assistance of a stand-in guitarist called Anthony Rosamundo. In early September, shortly after a triumphant Baby Shambles gig at London's legendary Hope and Anchor pub, Pete was sentenced to 6 months in prison for burglary. After an appeal, this was shortened to 2 months, and in the event his spell inside was more like 5 weeks. Carl was distraught. It's a stupid reaction, he said later, but I thought, I've jailed my friend. As Pete left Wandsworth Prison on October the 10th, there was a familiar figure waiting for him. Carl's motivation for being there was both emotional and practical. He wanted to make sure Pete's crackhead mates didn't get there first and lure him away. The 2 friends hugged, made their way to Chatham in Kent, where Pete arranged a combined solo gig and coming out party. Carl joined him on stage and made the announcement that many present thought they would never hear. The Libertines, as nature intended, Pete and Carl and John and Gary, were back in business.
sort of like, I think that's the great thing about Mick Jones, who produced it, was that he sort of really, in a way, sort of taught us to enjoy recording. It shouldn't be, it shouldn't be a chore. It should be fun.
Although the fans were delighted to see the boys in the band all present and correct, there was a feeling that a redeemed, chastened, cleaned-up Pete Doherty might lead to a toned-down, non-Arcadian Libertines. No worries on that account. Oddly, it was Carl who was to be the next victim of substance abuse, although his preferred drug was alcohol. Pissed out of his head, he slipped up in the bathroom and sliced his face open, requiring over 20 stitches. Meanwhile, the band was adding some prestigious names to its fan club. Alan McGee, the legendary founder of Creation Records and the man who discovered Oasis, was so impressed by the band's exuberant rock and roll antics that he became their new manager. McGee had nearly died as a result of his pharmaceutical adventures, so he was unlikely to be impressed by the Libertines' tale of debauchery alone. It was the music that sold them to him. Although Carl and Pete had always held rock gods like The Clash and The Smiths in high regard, they also carried the torch for a couple of less likely heroes, Chas and Dave. Chas Hodges and Dave Peacock were a pair of session musicians who'd achieved some success in the early 1980s with a string of novelty singles, all based around a knees-up piano style and rough Cockney harmonies. Their naff aura and contrived personas, described by some marketing genius as rockney, disguised the fact that they were skillful songwriters. Ain't No Pleasing You is a yearning, wryly tender ballad that Noel Gallagher would give his eyebrow to have written, if he knows anything about music. When the pair opened for the Libertines at a gig in the London Forum in December, smart-ass media observers thought it was all terribly ironic. But Pete and Carl meant it, man. Chas and Dave were as much a component of Arcadia as the Kinks or Ealing Comedies. On a small digression, the Libertines weren't the first cutting-edge musical act to make use of the skills of Messrs Hodges and Peacock. They'd played with the singer-songwriter Labi Siffre in the mid-1970s, and when his track, I Got The, was sampled by a young Detroit rapper over 20 years later, Chas and Dave ended up on a track by Eminem. Gertcha, indeed. Mick Jones, the producer of Up the Bracket, had already cemented his position as the Libertines' #1 fan within the punk hierarchy, and he was keen to work on the second long player. This time, he brought in engineer Bill Price, who had worked with him on the Clash's seminal London Calling album, regarded by many as the greatest punk record of all time. As well as putting them through their studio paces, Jones joined them on stage in March 2004 for an anti-racism benefit, performing a cover of Should I Stay or Should I Go?, his live showpiece and the Clash's first and only #1 hit. It was the first time Jones had performed the song in public since leaving the band. Another icon from the glory days of punk, Peter Perrett, played with the Libertines the following month. The frontman of The Only Ones had been through many years of heroin addiction, and his song, Another Girl, Another Planet, was interpreted by many as an analogy for the rush one gets from a hit of smack. To see Pete Doherty jamming with this deranged icon of junkie chic was an uncomfortable experience. But the hero-turned-fan who meant the most to the band was Morrissey. The devious, truculent and unreliable singer had been enjoying a critical renaissance that coincided with the rise of the Libertines, and had recently landed himself a new record deal after several years in the wilderness, or Los Angeles, whichever is nearer. He'd been given the chance to stage the 2004 Meltdown Festival, essentially an excuse for a notorious musical figure to turn London's South Bank into his personal jukebox for a few days in June. The Chief Smith's choices ranged from the reformed but unreformed glam punk pioneers, the New York Dolls, to the droll Yorkshire playwright and raconteur Alan Bennett. And just to show that this wasn't a senior citizens outing, Mozza found space on the bill for a few young whippersnappers, including, of course, the Libertines. It was a great compliment from one icon of quirky English rock to another, and the gig would have cemented the Libertines' reputation in the big league of alternative rock. But it was a gig that would never happen.
he's a very integral part. He's kind of one of the boys, really, when we were recording.
But what
I don't really
what
expect
Mick's
it.
really good at doing is sort of gauging the atmosphere in the studio.
He does really channel it, and he does instill us all with a certain confidence and faith. We all realise we're in it for if he was going to lay down rules, they'd be there to be broken. But I think just because he was one of us, and we all had the same kind of goal, and it's funny, as shambolic a fella as he is, he did really manage to keep it all in line.
Pete Doherty was still his wild self in true rock and roll style. It seemed as if one band wasn't enough for him. Apart from the Libertines, Baby Shambles was still a going concern, and he found time to duet with his friend Wolfman on the achingly sad top 10 single, For Lovers. But despite this rush of creative energy, Pete's self-destructive urges still bubbled under the surface. At the end of a 3-night residency at London's Brixton Academy in February 2004, he smashed his guitar, in apparent emulation of The Who's Pete Townsend, kicked over Carl's amplifier, then proceeded to cut his own chest up. It was a tribute, conscious or otherwise, to the ultimate punk junkie screw-up, Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols, who would regularly play with open wounds dripping claret onto his bass guitar. Not that it made much difference to his lousy musicianship, of course. Sid wasn't among the Libertines' admirers from punk's golden era, of course. He died of a heroin overdose in 1979 while on remand for stabbing his girlfriend to death. Carl later claimed that Pete's outburst had occurred because he took offence at the way his partner had looked at him. Appropriately, Doherty's eruption into violence occurred while the band was playing a new song, the harmonica-driven Can't Stand Me Now. In lacerating detail, it portrayed the relationship between Pete and Carl in terms of a festering, mutually damaging love affair, but one that had become too intense for either party to escape. "You twist and tore our love apart," sneered Carl, almost accusing Pete of destroying the Arcadian dream with his self-indulgent antics. And the accusations would redouble in strength, as it soon became obvious that Pete had tumbled off the wagon in quite spectacular style. In May, he went into the Priory, the London clinic famed for treating the mental and addiction problems of the rich and famous. After a week, he walked out, and then went to a clinic in France the following month, again quitting after a few days. In the midst of all this, Carl took the difficult decision of cancelling the band's appearance at Morrissey's Meltdown, as well as a high-profile slot at the Glastonbury Festival. The Meltdown pullout was particularly painful, although Gary Powell did appear, drumming for the New York Dolls. This pre-punk outfit, fronted by the outrageous David Johansen, had been notorious for its hedonism. 3 members had already died, and bassist Arthur Kane would pass away a few weeks after the London concert.